Hi again. So today we're going to be speaking about how the brain makes decisions. And we want you to learn today how decision making is studied in the laboratory. We're going to learn a model, or actually two related models, of decision making from the psychology literature. We're also going to study a neural circuit model of decision making. And we're going to try to gain an intuition into the decision making process from a dynamical systems perspective. So there are two major traditions in academia for studying decision making, and they focus on perceptual decision making and value based choice. So, perceptual decision making in real life can be very important. It's when you have to decide what you think you're seeing or what your senses are telling you. And let's look at this example from a realistic police training scenario in the United States.
You missed the baby, you missed the blind man.
So the point here is that Marge, undergoing her police training, has to decide based on sensory information, basically what people look like, whether somebody is a criminal and deserves to be shot, or whether they are likely innocent and don't. And a lot of us won't have this extreme scenario, but we have to make perceptual decisions all the time, such as whether we think a car is coming quickly on the road and we should cross or not, for example. In the laboratory, things tend to be simplified and controlled, and this is a typical perceptual decision making study in the lab. Here we're going to see a rat who is seeing a series of moving dots on the screen, and the rat is rewarded if it pokes its nose towards the side that the dots are predominantly moving. Just changed its mind there. So the rat seems to do this task quite well. And these dots that the rat showed tend to be mostly moving in the same direction. So that's quite an easy variant of what's called the random dot motion task. Here we can see in this video by Bobby Innes on YouTube a similar random dot motion stimulus with different levels of coherence. It's going to start with low coherence, where all the dots are moving in different directions, and it's going to change at times to very high coherence, where the dots tend to move in the same direction. So we can see that with increasing coherence, it becomes easier for us to decide in which direction the dots are moving. So in the brain, primary visual cortex, also known as V1, is the first part of the cortex that receives visual information, and then it propagates this basic visual information forward to several areas. And one of those areas is called MT, and it's called MT because it's the middle part of the temporal cortex. But it's quite a fortuitous name because MT also encodes motion, as we see here in this study by Britton and colleagues in 1996. They put an electrode in area MT and they recorded neurons from this area as monkeys viewed a random dot motion stimulus, very similar to the one we just saw. So for neurons that had their preferred direction in line with the direction of motion, they had very high level of firing during the entire period of the stimulus, as shown here on the left. In contrast, the neurons that had a preferred direction opposing to the direction of motion had a very low level of firing. We see as the coherence is reduced, so only a relatively small fraction of the dots are moving together in a particular direction, we see that there is still quite strong firing of the neurons that have the preferred direction aligned with that direction, but now we see an increase in the activity in the neurons that prefer the opposing direction, and that's because some of these dots are moving in their favorite direction. As we go down to very low level of coherence, so there's only a small amount of signal of the dots moving in one direction above the noise random movement level, and we see that both neurons that have the preferred direction aligned with this direction of motion and those that have the opposite preferred direction have pretty similar levels of firing. And this accurately reflects that there are a similar number of these dots moving in the preferred direction of this neuron and in the preferred direction of the opposing neuron. So this tells us that the area MT of the visual cortex quite accurately encodes the physical stimulus, that is, in this case, the direction of movement in dots on the screen. Now, if we look at monkeys who have commonly been trained to perform these types of tasks, we see that their behavior accurately reflects the difficulty of the task. That is, as the strength of the coherence of the stimulus goes down, their behavior goes from almost perfect to approaching the chance level of 50%. And also the time they take to make the decision, the reaction time, as the stimulus gets less coherent and more difficult, the reaction time goes up. So more difficult decisions take longer. And here we just see a representation of the task, where the monkey is looking at a fixation point here. There are two targets here. The motion stimulus comes on, and at the end of the trial, the monkey needs to move its eyes towards the dot that represents the direction of motion. Now, very commonly, this type of decision task is modeled using a drift diffusion model. Now, the drift diffusion model just says that the change at each little bit of time in a decision variable is the sensitivity times the motion coherence plus the noise. Okay, so the decision variable basically builds up the evidence in favor of a particular choice, and the choice is made whenever this decision variable crosses a boundary called the decision boundary. The motion coherence is the strength of the signal in a particular direction, and the sensitivity essentially controls the slope, or the rate at which you move towards a decision boundary. Now, in the literature more widely, when you're not necessarily thinking about this particular task, people think of the sensitivity times the motion coherence as the bias, or generally the strength of sensory evidence towards one decision or another. So in the drift diffusion model, we begin in between the decision boundaries, and we accumulate evidence in favor of one decision or the other. So evidence is essentially a subtraction of the sensory evidence in favor of moving to one direction minus the sensory evidence in favor of moving to the other direction. But there's a related model called the race model, in which sensory evidence, instead of being conceived of as a subtraction of the evidence for one direction minus the other, evidence is accumulated independently for each direction. And then there's a race between these two bits of evidence to see which reaches the decision boundary first. So we see the introduction of this leak term. So this decays back down to zero at a time scale determined by the time constant tau. Now, it's also possible to model the competition between different decisions by putting in inhibitory interactions between the two terms for the decisions A and B here, for example. So in this case, if the evidence for B is quite strong, this reduces the decision variable in favor of choice A. And this is particularly true if J, the competition term, is high. And if J is 0, then we get this model here, which represents the independent accumulation of evidence for each sensory stimulus. And this is represented here as the accumulating evidence for a choice. In this case, it's called choice 1 in red. And this can accumulate separately for different sensory pieces of evidence. And one of the advantages of the race model compared to the drift diffusion model is that it can easily be extended to decisions over more stimuli. So it doesn't have to just be between two directions, for example, or two stimuli. You can add on a third, or in fact several different choices between several different sensory stimuli. So here's an example of a perceptual decision-making task in which you have to choose between 3 different visual stimuli. And this would be quite difficult to model directly with the drift diffusion model and would require some adaptation of the model. Now, we previously saw that motion seems to be encoded quite well in area MT, but a decision shouldn't necessarily only encode the sensory evidence. In fact, at a certain point, it should change from something that maps the sensory signal into neural activity into something that looks more like a choice. And choices tend to be binary. You either select something or you do not. So in order to investigate which brain areas might be important for this choice, Shadlin and Newsom went and recorded from area LIP in the parietal cortex. And LIP, you can think of it as the next level of the sensory processing hierarchy. After area MT receives the visual information from V1 and it starts to process the motion information, it sends very strong outputs to area LIP. So for this task, Shadlin and Newsom, they again trained a monkey to respond to the direction of motion. However, they added in a delay period between the time in which the motion stimulus was presented and the go cue. So this allowed them to separately analyze neural activity relating to the accumulation of evidence from activity relating to the decision. And what they found was during the motion stimulus, there was this accumulation of information, like you see in an MT. And you can see that this happens more quickly for stronger stimuli with a higher level of coherence. You can see, for example, with very low coherence in red and green, it takes a little while for the signal to ramp up here. This is the firing response of neurons that prefer the direction of motion that is shown on the trial. And you see that information towards this decision ramps up more quickly for the stimuli with higher coherence, shown here in yellow and black. However, if we look at the end of the trial, this is just before the saccade, or the movement of the eye towards the response location, we see at this end of the trial all of these neural signals represent neural activity on trials with different coherence. They all seem to converge towards the same point. And these trials in the solid lines are trials in which the monkey is making a decision towards the favored location of these neurons. And these dashed lines are trials in which the monkey is making a decision towards the opposite direction. So we see that what starts as an information accumulation process, which looks a lot like the sensory evidence, converges towards something that looks a lot more like a binary choice. And then right before the movement, we see a big increase in activity, which is most likely related to the preparation of the movement. So this seems to be quite good evidence that this perceptual decision might be calculated in area LIP.